Next, we will be hearing from Dr. James Jackson, who is Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party USA, a founder and activist leader in the Southern Negro Youth Congress from its beginnings in the late 1930s until 1946. Dr. Jackson was also a veteran of World War II, fighting in Asia, fighting in India, I believe. And like Henry Winston, a native of the South, Dr. Jackson being a native of Virginia, and Henry Winston being a native of Mississippi. I will turn the microphone over now to James Jackson.
Comrade Henry Winston has certainly set the scene, and it was out of the turbulences of those times and the blank wall that black youth faced from the standpoint of opportunities to be able to look forward to growing into manhood, womanhood, with opportunities for development of the personality, for advancing and fulfilling themselves. The youth meeting the challenge took to heart what Frederick Douglass had said. We met in Richmond on Frederick Douglass' birthday, the day assigned to his birth, February the 14th through 17th in 1937, and they're resolved to address the problems in their economic aspect, in their political aspect, in their variegated social aspect, to strike the first blow. It isn't obligated for the oppressed and the tyrannized to fight alone, but he who would be free must himself strike the first blow. And so the disadvantaged black youth of the South commenced a youthful-led crusade for changing the area in which they lived. And as Comrade Winston has indicated, they dedicated themselves to the charge to secure for their people and for themselves every jot and tittle of rights, economic, political, social, enjoyed by all other Americans. And the stress was on militant initiative and organization, and to break all of the barriers that hemmed in black youth and denied them a future. At the same time, to extend a hand of fellowship and fighting comradeship with equally disadvantaged or near equally disadvantaged white youth of this generation, the Depression generation, the generation confronting the prospects of war, the generation that received all of the vibes of the fascist march that was already a part of the reality in Europe. It was a generation, nevertheless, that conceived of itself as the hope of its people. And the student youth had already begun asserting themselves, and there were some half a dozen student campuses which had local revolts on them against the restrictions and the abuse of academic freedom and the impoverishment and disadvantages that black youth were subjected to. Louis Burnham, who later was to become a leader of the Southern Negro Youth Congress and an outstanding personality in the struggle of the 40s in behalf of black liberation in general, Louis Burnham was a leader of a number of these student struggles which took place on the campuses of Southern colleges and universities in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. The first big action of the Southern Negro Youth Congress after it was formed was to address the problem of the most disadvantaged and oppressed of the working people. The tobacco workers of Richmond, Virginia, made a spontaneous action at the Carrington-Mishaw plant, a rather small plant, which had been a tobacco factory under slavery. And the sons of the slaves were still working in that plant. Very elderly women in the main, and very junior young people. Super exploited, and they no longer could abide the conditions, and so had a spontaneous strike. The tobacco workers' call for community help to their plight was answered by the Southern Negro Youth Congress, already an organization of some months old. And the youth became the organizers of the tobacco workers. And from the small Carrington-Mishaw strike, finally there was, in the summer of 1937, the massive strike of the export leaf tobacco workers, the British American Tobacco Company. And this was a gigantic battle of labor against local and national capital. And black labor played the dominant role in this, and the youth were their leaders in this important action. So the Southern Negro Youth Congress initiated the organization of an independent federal union, the Tobacco Stemmers and Laborers Industrial Union, and affiliated it directly to the CIO, and subsequently this body of workers inspired big struggles throughout the South. The first major strike that had occurred in Richmond, Virginia since 1910 took place in the summer of 1937 with the giant strike at Export Leaf Tobacco Company. This struggle was won, and the munificent sum of some 25 cents an hour was secured in wages. Before that, wages of tobacco stemmers was 10 cents an hour. And nevertheless, the importance of this was that it established in struggle the principle of the minimum wages and hours law. The initial provision was for a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour. And it brought the rehandling industry under the protection of federal minimum wage law. This subsequently escalated, set in motion a whole chain of labor organizing activities, not only among tobacco workers, but among the Menhaden fisheries along the coast and in the Gulf. It stimulated the organization of the oyster tongers in the Tidewater and Hampton Roads. It stimulated the organization of the peanut workers in the Eastern Shore counties of Virginia. And subsequently, the school teachers took the cue from the humble tobacco workers and organized a tight teachers organization that is part and parcel of the NEA to this day. From the initiative of the youth, there was an extension of organizing activity throughout the South along the chain of the Virginia-Carolina fertilizer network of plants that went all the way to Georgia from Virginia. And the Southern Negro Youth Congress not only addressed itself to the economic struggles, but concerned itself with the cultural forces that black people as a whole lived in. There was no access to culture. There was no theater other than a few seats in the Jim Crow gallery, where in such cities as Richmond, Virginia, not to speak of Jackson, Mississippi, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, you had to enter the peanut gallery on Saturday by going up the fire escapes on the outside of the theater. All other days it was for whites only. And there was organized in Richmond, Virginia, a community theater, and plays were put on by writers such as Langston Hughes, and this was extended into the South and had find its expression in New Orleans. That will be spoken about later, where Thomas Richardson was the director of theater and cultural activities in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and organized the theater not only in Richmond, Virginia, but in New Orleans and elsewhere. Then the Southern Negro Youth Congress moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee for its second Congress. It was not an accident, the choice of places. It was following the trail of the new organizing initiative of labor in the South. Chattanooga was a labor, Tennessee was a labor state. Chattanooga was in the heart of the steel and ore area. And the Tennessee Valley Authority in Knoxville was the center of organizing activity. And so the Southern Negro Youth Congress, Second Congress, assembled in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and some 500-600 young people assembled there and enacted a stirring program of demands to address the urgent needs of people at that time in the South and in the nation as a whole. At the Chattanooga conference, there were students from abroad and youth from abroad. This was to become one of the hallmarks that distinguished the organization of the Southern Negro Youth Congress from other organizations of young people, such as Winston referred to, of the Christian youth organized in the Epworth League, in the BYPU, in the YW, YMCAs, and so forth. That is the identification with the struggle for freedom on a global scale, the struggle of the people of Ethiopia against Mussolini's savage assault, not unlike the assault on Grenada today by our tin horn Mussolini. God save the mark. Then in China, the Japanese were attacking China, and the Chinese people on their part were seeking to achieve their political independence from Japanese domination and their social emancipation from oppression in general at the same time. And there came to the United States a young representative from this movement of the Chinese masses named Lo Tse. And Lo Tse was present in Chattanooga, and along with her was Rajna Patel from India, representing the Indian National Congress, the youth, which was then under the British Raj, not free, independent India with its own leadership under Indira Gandhi, but it was under the British control. So the bonds of world solidarity reinforced the will of the youth in the South and broke any sense of isolation. Of course, at every meeting of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, there was present sizable representation of white youth. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, from the very beginning, had the foresight and the energy and patience to maintain an approach to build unity with the majority of young people who were white. In Chattanooga, a number of white young people participated in the affairs of the conference. And then, following Chattanooga, was the Third Congress, which was in Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, Alabama, the focus of concern was a galloping police brutality, the official terror directed against the youth. And some of the dramatic cases slipped my mind. After all, we were talking 40 years ago. Nevertheless, there were such cases as the Nora Wilson case, which came somewhat later. But there was a very famous case, but for the life of me, I can't think of it, where youth standing in line on a Saturday to buy a ticket to go up in back of the theater and climb the fire escape for some moment of recreation, was shot down in cold blood because he had strayed a foot or two off the line. And this became the famous O.D. Henderson case. And Edward Strong, who was then the head of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, called a meeting at the church, big church nearby, and the police beat him to the pastor. And the pastor locked the church and went out of town, and this was the case of all of the churches. And in many instances, there was no place to assemble, and never any place when black and white together could assemble as co-equals. Nevertheless, a meeting was held, a huge rally on the steps of the church, and action was taken. I mentioned this police brutality case because there was no issue too small or too big to be addressed. On another occasion, we investigated the lynching of 2 returned soldiers and their wives who were chained to trees and shot to death as an execution of terror, to say to returning soldiers that you have no rights that we are bound to respect, notwithstanding the fact that you have been abroad carrying the charter of the 4 freedoms to other peoples. You will come back, take off your uniform, and get behind the Jim Crow pale. Well, in Birmingham, Alabama, they also, at the Third Congress of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, addressed the economic problems. Even during the war years, blacks were discriminated against so severely that they were excluded from the workforce in one area after another, when the war industries themselves hungered for labor power. And a big struggle was undertaken for jobs. Then the New Orleans Conference, the 4th conference, which will be discussed by Grace Bassett. But one of the central emphases at this conference was the right to vote. Already there had taken place in New Orleans in Shakespeare Park a very dramatic mock election in which more people cast ballots in this mock election than voted in the regular election. And this dramatized the hypocrisy and the votelessness of and injustice of the criminal exclusion and denial of the right to vote. The Southern Negro Youth Congress launched a massive nationwide campaign to draw focus on the right to vote in the South. Then, finally, there was the Seventh Congress of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Columbia, South Carolina. This Congress followed the Sixth Congress, which was held in Atlanta, Georgia. It's not for nothing that I skipped the Sixth Congress, because I wasn't there. I was in Burma in the war, and Winston was in Europe in World War II. And nevertheless, with Dorothy Burnham, Louis Burnham, and Esther Cooper Jackson, the Atlanta Congress was a great success. And though it took place under the tensions of wartime, if the South was bad before the war, it was like walking on eggshells during the war, because there was a patriotic excuse to beat you over the head and slam you into jail and to set mobs upon you. They could carry a flag and no one would trouble themselves about it. But during the war, with great skill, the youth of the Southern Negro Youth Congress led their people in resistance in the heart of the Deep South and won gains, some substantial gains, like 10,000 jobs at the Bechtel McCone Parsons plant, jobs in the Mobile shipyards, where women, for the first time, won the right to be welders and worked on the Liberty ships, and so forth. These were fierce struggles, bloody struggles, with imprisonment and broken bones and broken heads, and very little publicity about them. This was before the age of television, and the only time blacks got in the press was when they were being pursued like animals by police authorities and lynch mobs. In any event, the Southern Youth Legislature, which took place in Columbia, South Carolina, was a massive event, and it was sparked by the fact the return of veterans, and the tone of the call to the Southern Youth Legislature was a very militant tone, demanding freedom now. We can wait no longer, it said. Each generation has had its historic task to become the first full-fledged voting generation of Negro Americans is ours. We are the sons and daughters of a people of courage. Ours is a history of struggle for democracy. We are not alone. Our cause is the fight of all Americans who hold democracy and freedom dear. And then it goes on to assert forcefully the demands for the abolition of the poll tax, for FEPC law guaranteeing the right to work at all jobs, for federal anti-lynching legislation, for equal access to equal housing, adequate health and educational facilities, for an end to all manner of white supremacy customs and practices which violate the human dignity and rights of black people. And it called on the youth to lead a new crusade by all means to achieve the freedom. And so I leave my legend at that point.
Thank you very much. I should add that in my haste and excitement to introduce everyone else, I forgot to introduce myself. So if you're wondering who Mr. X is up here, my name is Gerald Horn, and I teach history at Sarah Lawrence College. Our next speaker, like our past two speakers, is equally a native of the South, a native of New Orleans in this particular instance. Grace Tillman Bassett was a member of the National Council of the Southern Negro Youth Congress from 1939 through 1948. She was an active leader of the New Orleans chapter of the SNYC, where, as Dr. Jackson indicated, some of the fiercest battles throughout the entire South took place. So now I turn the microphone over to you, Grace Bassett.
A bit surprised to hear Henry Winston say that Forrester Washington had opposed the formation of the Congress, because by the time I came along, I was in the School of Social Work, and I asked permission to go to Birmingham, and I went with Forrester Washington's blessings, which showed that changes had taken place. New Orleans was active and involved in the Southern Negro Youth Congress from its founding. But as I stated, I came upon the scene just a little later. The New Orleans chapter was very active, was one of the largest chapters in the Congress. And its major focus was the right to vote. The slogan, voteless people is a hopeless people. Do you want to be hopeless? Was the slogan that the Congress flung to the people of New Orleans and vicinity, because the chapter was not just active in the city. James Jackson spoke a little bit about the right to vote campaign which was conducted. At that time, there was a mere handful of people registered to vote, but this campaign led the groundwork for the election of the black mayor of New Orleans now, Ernest Morrell. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, in its right to vote campaign, nudged the NAACP into activity, and they also became involved in the right to vote campaign. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, as has been said, carried its activities out into the rural areas. And again, as was pointed out, it was not easy. There were three main events that I'd like to discuss. One relates to Mississippi, the notorious billboard, whose election was being challenged because of denial of the right of the blacks to vote, was being brought up in front of a congressional committee in Mississippi, which, as you know, is no small feat. And getting people to testify was the problem. The New Orleans Youth Congress sent its representatives over to Jackson, Mississippi, to bolster the courage and give support to the young people who were going to those people. All right, I'll go, but be prepared with flowers for my grave, because he really thought he'd be killed. He wasn't killed. Bilbo got a rebuff, and later on, the right to vote campaign was stimulated further in Mississippi, and you all know about what's happening in Mississippi now. Another example was a person who was registering people for the NAACP by the name of Alvin Jones. He was organizing the registration, and he was killed. He was a young man, a young married man. His daughter is in New York at this time. we need to look at. That's Alva Buxenbaum's father. A third example of the kinds of things that took place around the registration drive was a farmer and a labor organizer by the name of Clinton Clark. Clinton Clark was out there all by himself organizing, and they arrested him. And we were sure they were going to lynch Clinton Clark. They would have, except that the New Orleans chapter burned up the wires to the Attorney General, to the newspapers, to everybody, saying they're going to lynch Clinton Clark. Well, they didn't dare lynch Clinton Clark with the focus, with the spotlight of the whole nation upon them around the question of registration. James Jackson has spoke about the People's Community Theater, which was organized in New Orleans by Tommy Richardson, who was a brilliant young playwright, actor, and director, as well as an artist. This group took the registration campaign and the struggles of the black youth into the communities in New Orleans and in surrounding areas in the form of culture. They presented Langston Hughes's play, Don't You Want to Be Free? And in churches and in schools and in houses and any place they could get, they took the play, which spoke in terms of registering to vote, of fighting for jobs, of fighting for dignity for black people. It was very successful, and it did a great deal to advance the cultural aspects of the youth movement. The New Orleans Congress that James Jackson has alluded to took place in 1940. It was one of the highlights of the Southern Negro Youth Congress's activities. And as he said, it was around the right to vote. It was a highly successful Congress, but not without controversy. Because of the success of the organization of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, elements entered in to attempt to disrupt and really to break up. Under the usual slogan, guess what? Anti-communism. They tried to red bait. However, they were not successful. Now, at this Congress, by this time, we had as sponsors heads of universities, the head of Dillard, some outstanding people at Xavier, throughout the country, in addition to which O'Hare Lanier, who at the time was an administrator of the National Youth Congress, was present. I will never forget how Lanier stood. Lanier was like a lion in the midst, and he roared his disapproval of the disruption. Actually, in a way, he reduced the opposition to minuscule heights and made the rest of the people see what the intent was, and therefore the Congress was highly successful, and the organization went on, as has been pointed out by James, to bigger and greater things. In New Orleans, also, as in other parts of the country, that there was support for the labor movement. New Orleans had the waterfront organized, the ILA, the ILWU, transport, and all these were in the CIO. So it's the whole question of support to the organization of the CIO was given, and in turn, the unions helped to support the Youth Congress. The New Orleans Congress flourished until the United States entered World War II. Then, as in other places, the top leadership was drafted off. At that time, the top leadership happened to be male. And They plucked off one leader after other in the national organization as well as in the New Orleans organization, and the women had to come to the fore. Namely Esther, Grace, Dorothy, and Louis, who at the time I think was here in New York, came down to head the Birmingham office. And so we carried on as best we could. And in New Orleans, we formed a coalition with a student organization, a white student organization called the New Orleans Youth Congress. They were the New Orleans Youth Council. They were composed of students from Tulane University and Newcomb College, both of which were all white. However, they joined hands with us. They joined us in the parks with the registration campaigns. They coalesced with us, and together with them, we were able to sort of hold the fort until the men got back. I won't say that we entirely turned it back over to the men, but we were glad to see them come back. We continued our efforts, as I said, the major effort and focus being the voters' campaign. And as you can see, it was successful in that there is now a black mayor in New Orleans. I think Esther is going to pick up the story from here.
Very good. Very good. Very good.
Thank you very much. It was very good. Next, of course, is Esther Jackson, who is managing editor